dedicated to ensuring that Canadians understand the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians do not consider this, and it's our job to ensure that they do. The NATO Association regularly puts on events to inform Canadians about issues of security and the value of NATO to Canadians. We usually put on about one Zoom event per week, more or less. We'd be thrilled if you wanted to join in our conversations in the future, and we're thrilled to have you here today. If you are part of the live stream of the event, you can ask questions in the sidebar to your right. Please put them in as early as you can, so that Martine Gazuli, one of our program editors, can make sure that your question gets answered. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Joseph McQuade. He is our editor-in-chief at the NATO Association of Canada, and we're privileged to have him. He's also the director of our Center for Disinformation Studies. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Joseph.
Thank you. And just for the benefit of the audience, in terms of our structure, I'll be holding a structured Q&A with our guest, and we will then open up to questions from the audience within the last 15 minutes or so. So if questions do come up, do be sure to write them in the chat, and then we'll address as many of them as we have time for. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest. Alexandra Alvarova is a recognized authority in political marketing and public relations, a sought-after seminar leader, facilitator, and public speaker. Her 2017 book, The Industry of Lies, traces Russian hybrid warfare tactics in the 2013 presidential election in the Czech Republic, and argues that this provided a vital trial run for Moscow's later interference in the 2016 US presidential election. Alexandra, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that President Baines and myself have really been looking forward to speaking to you for quite some time. And so I thought that it would be helpful to start by setting the context for our audience regarding some of the terms that we'll be using. So on your website, The Industry of Mind, you have a timeline showing some of the history of propaganda, something that we're very interested in at the Center for Disinformation Studies. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about what propaganda is, what it does, and how it may overlap or differ from other terms such as hybrid warfare or disinformation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm glad we have this unique opportunity to speak together in these very bad times. So to the topic generally, propaganda is a very specific form of intense communication with a large population built on persuasion techniques and serving mostly to a political or ideological purpose. Then we have disinformation. Disinformation is a technique belonging to the information warfare. It's more complex, more sophisticated. It aims to deceive the enemy, destroy its cognitive capacity, and push the people on the other part, push them towards bad decisions. So disinfo and propaganda are part of information warfare. And then we have that term which stands above them all, and this is hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is a military term standing at the top of the pyramid, and it includes disinformation, propaganda, reflexive control, psychological operations, but also regular military operations, special forces, cyber attacks, and business operations, diplomacy. All these together creates a warfare with combination of military and non-military means aimed to destroy the enemy on a very complex way. I have to admit I use the word propaganda sometimes on an improper way, like a very general term. But here is the thing, we are living in an era where semiotics and symbols and their meanings are actually reshaped in social discourse on social media every day. And most of the people do not know what the hybrid warfare means or what information warfare means at all. They just have a limited experience with the word propaganda. So that's why I use the word propaganda that much, that they understand. They still have the same we both parts of communication have the same meaning of the term. Yeah, meaning of words actually are today no longer defined by linguists. It's a vector between public discourse, mainly on social media, between information war actors and experts. So in that triangle, we are standing somewhere in the middle and trying to flow in that primordial soup of meanings and not to lose the context. Yeah, the information environment is today heavily polluted, not only by switching the meanings, but by bad actors and their actions. So the public soul is actually easy to manipulate, not only by wrong informations, but also by a wrong context. And this is what we have to deal with.
Sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I think that hopefully that will help get everyone on the same page in terms of the vocabulary that we'll be using and how these different terms interrelate. But certainly it is true that these meanings can tend to be very fluid and can also really kind of cross-pollinate with each other very often. So I appreciate that point as well. So just kind of taking a step back now from where we are, I know that your own personal backstory growing up in the former Czechoslovakia seems to have had a profound impact on the work that you currently do. So I wondered if you could tell the audience a little bit about what it was like growing up in Cold War Czechoslovakia and how this has shaped your work.
Yeah, I lived my childhood in a small working class town near to Prague. It was actually a little bit different from Prague. The iron fist of the Communist Party ruled there with a hard hand. It was not so easy than in the liberal capital of the Republic. My school, my teaching, my books, also television broadcasts for kids, all this was heavily shaped by the obligatory communist propaganda narratives. It was omnipresent everywhere, like corner posters, communist slogans in grocery store windows, pictures in storybooks for kids, small talks about the noble Russians and rough Americans, all that public communication discourse and conversation in the even in the classroom, the small talks in the classroom, all was somehow shaped by the prescribed emotional form of tribal hatred. It will be important later, I'll explain you, but that atmosphere was very important in shaping my later experience with propaganda. We didn't notice at this time, we didn't notice it anymore, how deeply imprinted this type of coded communication was in our mind. Propaganda was just institutionalized in semantics, semiotics, in every breath we took. It made us who we are and how we grew up. I have two strong memories from my childhood. First, there was a book we had to read in the school in the first grade. The story was about poor rural family who suffered during the economical crisis in the 30s. The father of the family sold his house and moved with his son to the city to get a job in the factory. And one day he ended up jobless because the factory owner, bad capitalists, needed to increase the profit. When I found this book in my old box after 20 years, I still could read the tiny letters written on my tiny childish hand. Shame on you, Dachsner. It was the bad capitalist with the German name. And the German name was specifically important because the propaganda indirectly also influenced our relations to our neighbors, Germans. And then in the story, the father entered the Communist Party, workers fought together and won, and happy endings, the rich overeducated Democrats lost and the paradise could begin. And the second story I still can remember is the movie that my class and I had watched as a part of our school lessons. The name of the movie was Jan Hus, and it was a historical falsehood of the real story of Luther's predecessor. Jan Hus was a Czech priest criticizing the Catholic Church for 100 years before Luther. And communists used his story and twisted his story for their purpose, propaganda purposes. Jan Hus was executed by the decision of Emperor Sigismund, presented in the movie as an evil German, because the rule was still the same. If you have a German figure, so be it rich and cruel. And the movie envisioned the priests and the Catholic Church as a group of obese homosexuals. And I still can remember the painful hatred at those fat smeared spinsters left in my heart while Jan Hus was burning on the pyre. And I felt like bad enemies, bad church and bad Germans. And I was like 7, 8 years old, and the memory is still in my mind so vivid. And I lost these painful reflexive instincts deeply rooted in my subconsciousness by propaganda. I lost it in the puberty when my parents finally explained me that communists are our worst enemies. And as a daughter of a dissenting father, I wasn't allowed to study at the university. And suddenly all the crap the communists told us turned into the opposite in my mind when I realized what's the reality, what was the propaganda, how the things are really going on. And my parents taught me how to pretend I believe everything what the regime says and think something else. This double think and double speak like home and public, but also an obligatory emotional pretending of love to Communist Party and then hatred to anyone else was so repugnant. It was a kind of, let's say, soul rape, that a lot of people rather lived in one or another reality, just not to get insane. A lot of my friends or neighbors rather choose conformity, or they went to dissent, not to be pushed to live the both lives together. Yeah, my interest in manipulation, of course, by that history and by that experience, personal experience, grew day by day, year by year. I wanted to know what their power of persuasion was. I was always a passionate reader, so I read psychology, world psychology, Russian psychology school, but also some basic books about communication theory, media theory. And when the Velvet Revolution came, I became first journalist and then a public relations specialist. Yeah, that's the story in a cube.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. I do think that this is part of kind of how you're able to bring such a unique and valuable perspective, is that you have kind of, you've both lived within this kind of system, but are also, you know, now an expert on studying it as well. And so you're kind of able to merge those personal experiences, which I think are important, because I think that when we're talking about disinformation or propaganda, it can be very easy to discuss it as something that is kind of put out there and then kind of received by these almost passive consumers. Whereas I think it is really important to kind of foreground that those lived experiences for the people who are observing or consuming that material, you know, it is very subtle and it is very pervasive, and it's not something that's as simple as kind of, oh, why do people believe this or that? And I think something that we can learn from here as well. I mean, certainly our experience is very different than under, you know, Cold War communism, but at the same time, you know, we do, and we'll kind of discuss this more later, but we do live in a society where there is, you know, conflicting information. There are kind of bad actors who want people to believe one thing over another. And so I do just think that that's a very valuable perspective that you bring. And so getting to your book, The Industry of Mind, you make a really compelling argument that Russia used the Czech Republic's 2013 presidential election as a trial run for the electoral interference strategies that were then famously deployed in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. And I found this really interesting because we certainly see a lot about 2016, about Brexit and interference there. But I think that this was a really compelling argument regarding how these tactics were first tried out in the Czech case. And so I wondered if you could take this opportunity to explain what happened in the 2013 Czech election and why this was so important for Russian strategists going forward.
Yeah, it was I guess 2012 when I for the first time noticed that something fishy is going on in Czech information environment. There was suddenly a sudden silent explosion from everywhere, from every corner of internet. New media popped up, new Facebook pages, news groups, discussion platforms, new websites, new anonymous journalists and anonymous web pages with news and opinions. But along with them came a growing discussion about Muslims, Islam, about murky murders and rape crimes, about Europe's horrific historical experience with Turks and Arabs, about their violent culture, and of course available only in so-called alternative media, because the mainstream media lie. That was the narrative. At this time in Syria, Assad had just started slaughtering civilians with Russian backing him. Not a single refugee had reached Europe back then, and the whole country was already trembling with fear. The narrative about the horrors of Islam was pronounced by many mouths. It came from literally from everywhere. It was omnipresent. And soon it seemed to be an opinion of the majority. People felt like that the fear from Islam and about the war with Islam is about to break tomorrow. And we have to do something. Someone should protect us. And this went for almost 1 year, maybe later. And the discussion on internet got more brutal, more divisive, dirtier, and more taboos, communication taboos were broken. More lies were spread. I felt like my head will explode. We all had a total buffer overflow from that new information stream. After 1 year, the country was moved by one single theme: intruders, protect the border. I fell for it. I have to admit, I fell for it at the very start by myself. But suddenly, as a communication professional, I began to feel something very strange there. And I knew this feeling. It was, I've had it before, but I just didn't know what was it. That tribal anger, that organized hatred. And suddenly my childhood was back. The feelings, the obligatory feelings, the omnipresent, strong hatred feelings, the syntax, even the style was the same, the semiotics, the symbols we were used to were the same, just the enemy changed. And I made a little private research and my conclusion was very scary. There was no obvious client behind that communication campaign, no obvious product, no political party, just stories, just feelings, pure feelings, slurs, the atmosphere of fear and aggression. And I thought someone was trying to change the contemporary discourse of the Czech Republic. Politicians and journalists joined at the moment, and they felt we will surf the waves because this is what the people want to hear. And the so-called Overton window moved dramatically from the domestic troubles, from corruption, organized crime, environmental issues, pension plans, and the usual discussion stuff, to one main claim: Intruders prepare with a lot of supportive narratives. These supportive narratives were just a very well-known, simple old communist and Russian crap. I knew this before. Americans are evil, EU is evil, NATO is evil, educated people are selling our country to intruders, science is silly, don't listen to science, dictatorship of minorities is here, Western countries are completely morally rotten, German is a fascist state. I knew it. I knew the tone. It remained the same. I had actually no proof. There were no names under the articles. It was all anonymous, mostly anonymous. But I was pretty sure it's Russia. I felt they are up to something. I just didn't know. I had no idea. What is it? What are they aiming at? Enter presidential elections 2013. And suddenly it was all clear. Their candidate, Miloš Zeman, and his campaign came up with the idea of a promise of closed borders, a barbed wire. That at this time it was no wall, the symbol of the wall. It was the later Bannon stuff. First it was a closed border, barbed wire, and suddenly in that Orwellian twist of the previous symbol of oppression, which was the barbed wire at the border, it turned to a symbol of protection, like close the border, please, we need someone to protect us. Intruders are taking our jobs, intruders raping our women, attacking our homes, eating our food. And 1,000 of voices around in internet, 1,000 on Twitter, asked Miloš Zeman to renew the order, save us from the left liberal EU and bring back the good old times, old good times. Make our country great and safe again. Let's take our country back. Do you remember? So these voices were talking to the oldest and most powerful symbols of humankind and awakening the fear and the defense reflex. Less educated people who feel how they lose the contact with the reality, with the fast changing disruptive reality. Older people who wanted just simply their youth and health back, people in small villages, former communists, people prone to violence or frustrated by their financial situation, all of them suddenly knew by that new narrative who is guilty, intruders. So all their troubles suddenly got a common enemy. Never ever before the peace-loving Czech hobby gardeners were experiencing such a stimulation of their killing reflex. It was so strong. People panicked in hysteria. It was really unprecedented atmosphere. As a political marketing, I observed a lot of political campaigns and election campaigns before, but never before we've experienced such an atmosphere in an election like this time. It was full of slurs, full of personal attacks, tribal hatred. At the very end of the campaign, when every single troll on internet shamed Zeman's opponents, there came the final fake news. The Zeman's opponent, his competitor, received, or he was, they spread a pamphlet about his connections with our enemy, with the Germans. And older people who mostly vote, not the young ones, the older, who are the main disciplinated voters, are very sensitive to Germans like our historical enemy, and connection between the candidate and Germans. It was something unbearable. It was fake, but it worked. And Zeman won the election. And so the Russians got their candidate to the position. And people in the Czech Republic later, I knew And I understood through reading of different studies and researches that people in the Czech Republic have very similar characteristics, socio-demographic characteristics and opinions. Like, for example, the population in some United States, in some US states, mainly where Trump dominated the elections, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama. So when I saw later Steve Bannon and his campaign, driven by his military knowledge and admiration of Russian history, his methods, his strategic genius, I have to admit, I finally understood. We were their experimental guinea pigs, and the test went really fabulously, I'm afraid. So the only thing they couldn't use and transfer was the data, because we are a small, tiny country with 10 million people, and it wasn't possible to use the same method and to use the same data set for a country which is 30 times more populated. But there was still Steve Bannon, Cambridge Analytica, and all their data connections to big data providers. So they solved this problem for them. And when you consider that data is actually a new uranium of this era. But unfortunately, we are in the time when it's not possible to make a treaty about this. Like before, there was a SALT1, and the world was bipolar. There was Soviet Union and America, and two partners could negotiate this. Today, it's not possible anymore. Russian state doesn't exist de facto. It's a multinational criminal syndicate driven by mad Russian psyche, and America has Trump. So we are in an unprecedented situation where the data is slowly gaining the strength of former nuclear weapons. It has a huge destruction potential, and we have no partners and no tools how to stop this trend. Lenin once said that capitalists will sell us the rope on which we will hang them later. This sentence is actually still valid. Our military and marketing subcontractors simply seemed to find new wealthy clients, and that's the problem. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, I think I'm sure that what you've been speaking of will resonate for many members of our audience, really kind of regardless of which country they're from. We've, certainly can identify similarities to the US, but also other places like Britain and even places further afield. We do see that this kind of hardening of borders and this kind of call against intruders, this demonization of the enemy is something that we can see, whether it's in the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar or whether it is in the, ICE detention centers along the US-Mexico border. So I wanted to build a little bit more, though, on what you were saying about data. And so I think one thing that kind of comes up with this, and that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is how do new technologies and digital technologies specifically reshape this information landscape? Because as you identify, the use of propaganda and all of that is nothing new. So does it make sense to understand current disinformation and social media campaigns as extensions out of a longer kind of Soviet and perhaps even older playbook? Or does the internet, and especially the so-called Internet of Things that merges the online and the offline worlds to an unprecedented degree, do these new technologies require that we assess 21st century information operations in a completely new manner?
Let us start at the end of your question. Yes and no. Yes, most of the creating content methods are still based on the old Soviet playbook. However, the internet and data analysis with machine learning and even AI, it created an unexpected effect and turned the paradigm upside down. Back in these old Soviet times, the quality of the manipulative content was always highly demanded. Like, it has to be good stuff, a good story, good fabricated, hand in hand with social science, with good knowledge of history, local symbols, believable background, and a tiny bit of lie. Then the information laundry took place, and the following logistic in the background, it means like disinformation operation, how to deliver it fast and how to make the damage big. It seemed never to be the main stuff in the whole thing. Right now, so back then the damage was limited and local. Right now, we have the possibility that the malign information, no matter what quality, it can hit the whole planet within 24 hours. So it dramatically changed the paradigm. What's more important? There's a story, my personal story to this. Last year, there was a seminar made by Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver. It was a special event on disinformation, where the main speaker was Dr. Jonathan Albright, American specialist for disinformation networks. And he focused on amplification technologies and the scale of the network capacity in his speech. And, you know, I'm an old school. I always thought that the content and the context is the most important stuff. And the channels and their volumes are not that important anymore. And I opposed some of his opinions, but then I realized that I'm wrong. He proved me wrong. Do you know the flat earth conspiracy? I know it's unbelievable crap, but what if I tell you that even this obvious nonsense could be approved by growing and growing percentage of the population if repeated by many sources for a longer time? It sounds weird, right? But the American psychologist Robert Zions proved this scientifically, it's so-called mere exposure effect, I guess in the year 1968. It says, the more you see something, the more you like it, no matter what's the content. The quality is not important anymore if you have enough capacity to repeat it and to spread it as an omnipresent majority narrative. So this is what made the persuasion in the era of automated amplification and behavioral targeting to a weapon of mass distraction. The more you see it, the more you like it. And the whole Bannon strategy of the project Cambridge Analytica, the project was named The War. It started 2012 and went to 2016 to the American election, relied on this simple fact. Bannon called his strategy flood the zone with shit. So sorry for being so explicit. So it's exactly nothing more than the ability of the strong capacity to use the strong capacity of the channel to multiplicate, to amplify, and repeat, say it, repeat it, say it again. And suddenly, even the people who thought first, oh, what a nonsense, then when they are exposed for the second, for the third time, for the 4,000 times, they start somehow lose their resilience against the BS. They think, okay, it somehow belongs to my mental universe, it's there. I get used to it. I better get used to it. Everybody's talking about it. Maybe it's not that wrong. There could be something in it. And this is how it works. And our problem basically is when the Soviet Union started to disintegrate 29 years ago, Americans in Britain gave a sigh of relief and flashed a victory sign and turned their backs to that particular part of the world. But what, if anything, has changed in those years? Only our vigilance. We today live in some kind of complacently blissful oblivion We somehow acknowledge the proven fact that Russia meddles and interferes in our political processes, but we just simply don't ask why anymore. We no longer remember when Russia wanted nothing less than to erase the USA and NATO countries from the map. Let me remember that, emphasize that it all started already many, many years ago. As early as 1996, Russian military science literature was presenting the first blueprints for a new type of that war. Realizing that they would never defeat America by either military or economic means, the Russians turned to the two fields where they excel, social science and cybernetics. And they developed a highly innovative warfare system that incorporates a lot of methods completely unknown to the public. People today think, oh, this couldn't be a war when I don't hear no, like there is no shooting on the streets, but it remains unknown that this non-military warfare is way cheaper and way more powerful to change the enemy defense, to change the enemy recognition system and cognitive systems at all. So let me quote actually the General Viktor Nikolaevich Samsonov, who was the chief of the Russian General Staff in 1996. He said, the high effectiveness of information systems in combination with non-military means of influence makes it possible to disorganize the system of state administration first, hit strategic installations, and affect the mentality and moral spirit of the entire population. And this was the year 1996. So there were the first blueprints. There is something going on. And the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, this tiny article which the journalist Rob Colson discovered in the Russian military newspaper, that was the end of the road, the peak of the iceberg. They prepared it for a very, very long time. And we underestimated them badly, unfortunately. So what happened was actually just a logical synergy between old Russian desires and our own new technologies, partially of British or American origin. So the genius of Russia present day hybrid war attack is that it eliminates the use of both conventional and nuclear weapons, and it bypasses traditional boots on the ground contingencies by circumventing NATO. Moreover, this strategy allows the Russians to aim their assault directly at elected politicians, directly at ordinary voters, without running a risk of embarrassing military defeat. They go just another way. And given the fact that today Russia is no state entity within the definition of the term, but instead of a kind of symbiosis between states' political power and the most dangerous mafia bosses in the world, who transferred their statuses to oligarchy and put up the money for Putin's war campaign, we come to the conclusion that it's us who cannot compete. It's really new disruptive form. It's a new, fully disruptive paradigm of new criminal army. We remain at our old defense structures. They changed, this Russian animal changed the organism of warfare completely and combined all allowed methods which are not allowed in democracy, but in authoritarian system is completely accessible. And they combine it to their favor. And don't take me wrong, the Russian state is not excluded there. On the contrary, the strategy how to push oligarchs into obedience and use their monies What they do is actually they supervise and threaten oligarchs' families to keep them in line. There is a myriad of networks of dirty money between mafia and the state, начальство, силовики, Putin. The symbiosis between organized crime and decision makers, all this plays in Russia's favor. This time we are not facing a single state or its military or ideology. We are facing an unprecedented world criminal syndicate, and that's the heavy stuff. They have hackers, high-tech experts, masters of social networks, algorithms, and the intellectual elite of the world as private subcontractors who have no homeland and no state responsibility anymore. And with their help, the Kremlin has full access to every bit of information it wants and needs. With their minute understanding of how Google and social network algorithms process the information, and they are actually able to spread malicious disinformation in a minute, in an instant. They use our technologies against us, and we allowed this. So we are selling our own ropes. See Cambridge Analytica, see Google, see Facebook, see AI research companies.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm also reminded of Timothy Snyder's argument in The Road to Unfreedom, where he talks about how part of what makes this style of disinformation so powerful is that it actually doesn't need to convince you of anything. It just needs to sow doubt. And so if this propaganda doesn't win by convincing you. He uses the example of when the plane was shot down over Ukraine. And he says that, the goal of that disinformation is not actually to convince you anything about what happened, but just to raise questions about the official narrative. Yeah. So that undermines trust in public institutions. And we see this now with the undermining of public trust in WHO, in all of these institutions, our healthcare workers, the people who are at the front lines of the battle against COVID-19 right now. There is in many places this distrust with these institutions, with these people, and what makes it so difficult, and this is something that we've looked at with our Center for Disinformation Studies because of how it kind of pertains to Canadians, but what makes it so difficult to combat is that because it's just about sowing doubt, you can never really it's like a moving target. You can never really disprove what's being said because it's usually just about opening up a line of questions that can often be impossible to answer. And so when we're dealing with scientific questions, for example, yes, with science, there's always room for error and there's always space for science to be proven wrong or built upon. So as a result of that, those things that are just facts of how science works, and actually one of the strengths of the scientific method, that it grows, is instead kind of turned around and used as a weakness to say, oh, well, you can't say 100%, therefore my theory is as good as yours, when in fact, no, the one is, something that's been tested by some of the most brilliant minds in the world working together on a multi-billion-dollar budget, and the other someone came up with in a garage, but they gain this kind of power of this false equivalency. So I'm conscious of the time. We went a little bit further just because we did start a little bit late, and I wanted to make sure that we could still have our discussion. I had a couple questions that I wanted to raise regarding COVID-19, but I expect that those might come up in the questions as well. But I did want to just end with a couple of statistics that I was reading about kind of the current state of disinformation in Canada, because I think it is kind of interesting for framing our discussion, and we'll open it up to the audience at this point, but I did just want to put some of these numbers out there because I think they are kind of illuminating. So Philip Howard, a Canadian researcher heading the Oxford Internet Institute, recently told CBC News that the COVID-19 crisis has seen an uptick in misinformation, with 92% of state-backed disinformation coming out of the two states, Russia and China. So that in and of itself, I think is important to keep an eye on in light of everything that we've been discussing today. And the other statistics I had were polling reported by the National Post that indicate that 50% of Canadians believe that their government is hiding information regarding to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm actually not crazy about the phrasing of that, because, you know, you could within that 50% certainly have people who may think that the government is holding back information for the public's own good. So it doesn't really get into questions of motive there. But what is a bit more alarming is that you do have 19% of Canadians polled believe that the number of reported deaths had been exaggerated, and more than a third of respondents believed that the COVID-19 virus was man-made, you know, contrary to all of the evidence that we've actually seen from the scientific community. So we don't have to get into that now. I do want to leave time for audience questions, but I did just want to put that out there, and maybe that can kind of provide some context as we go forward with the conversation. But on that note, I do want to thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. And so I'll now hand things over to Martine, who can deal with the audience questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. McQuade. Thank you, Alexandra, for joining us today. I won't go into too much detail about myself. I just want to get right into the questions so that we leave as much audience time as possible. So the first question that I want to acknowledge is a question that I think pertains to a lot of what you were discussing in terms of your life story. So how you went, you know, from your 8 or 9 years old, experiencing all of this propaganda and disinformation to where you are today. So the question that was posed is, with the proliferation of social media consumption, how can young people in particular educate themselves on filtering the flux of information we receive every day?
Yeah, it's actually a big resource. Young people are actually my biggest hope in that whole stuff. When observing my son and my daughter, how they deal with social media, and I try, of course, I try to influence and inform them about the all the aspects and dangers which are very well known to us, but not so to them. So I think they appear some kind of way higher, not media literacy, but social media literacy. And they already know the fact or feel the fact that everything what they consume and the information they consume is that the value of the truth varies. It could be there are different variation and shades between the information value from 0 to 10. And they are already more experienced, instinctively more experienced than us, because they grew up in the world of the social media. And so despite the fact that we are scared about their lives and about their behavior in that complicated world, they are way more better equipped than we are. And this is my big hope. So it's not, I don't say that it's not necessary to educate them, because the media literacy, especially social media literacy, it's something like the draft or the conscription of tomorrow. We all need to do this in order to get a resilient population. But the young people seem to have to gain naturally the knowledge how the social media work, how is it constructed, and that not everything at all has to be truth. They even know, when I see my daughter after the first my first explanation about cybersecurity, about the potentially harmful content, she somehow gets that there is a lot of fake even behind the picture, which older generation does not get that easy. She already knows that the picture could be faked in many, many ways. And so I think that their way of learning this environment and absorbing this environment with all its difficulties, it's way better, way more complex. And we just need to make sure that they have some guidelines and they have some important teaching what kind of bad actors are waiting out there in the jungle and what do they want. And when the young people do get it, they can involve and absorb way better resilience than us, older generation. They are my big hope in that bad times.
Thank you for that response. I think it's really interesting to see your response to that question, as a lot of people see, you know, this technology kind of jump, a lot of people call it, affecting our ability to look at information in a different way. And a lot of people see it as something that we're not able to do in this day and age, just because technology has advanced so much in recent years. So I think it's really interesting for you to say that we're much more adept at, you know, looking at this information and actually analyzing it. So the next question I'm going to go to is in regards to COVID-19. As Dr. McQuade mentioned, he wanted to address a question of that nature. So the question is, given the new normal, there has been a mass transition towards the use of technology to make working at home possible. Can such a rapid transition push advances in the world of data weapons and AI? And specifically, what can Canada do to best prepare for this?
Yeah, as I said, data is actually the new uranium. It's extremely advantaged, it's extremely developed technology and powerful technology. And we need to be very careful with dealing with this. The problem is there is something in between data scraping and data analysis and us. There is always an interface, and that's social media. Our main problem, I think what I say now, you might disagree, but the main problem is that no matter what they say, no matter how much lobbyists will confirm from Facebook, will confirm you that they are not a media, they are just platforms, they're not responsible, they are just transmitting contents and have nothing to do with what's happening inside. They are media. In the term of Marshall McLuhan definition, they are media, they hell are. And we have to change our approach and our attitude to this. Because if you have a channel, if you provide a content, and if the content gets to the head of the percipient, so there is media. And before, we had the same problem in television, in the age of emerging television channel. So it was new. It could form our way how we perceive reality. We switched during these 50 years with television from literacy, from books to pictures. Now we are not people of books, we are people of picture. Most of young generation consumes the information, even their teaching, not from books anymore. They absorb YouTube, they absorb Wikipedia. So we are half electronic, half visual civilization. And there is no way to stop it. We just need to accept it. But at the disruptive time, in the disruptive era now, we need to recognize, and we have two disadvantages. First, social media is business, and they say us, keep repeating, they are not media. And the second problem is the biggest social media in the world is mainly Facebook, Twitter, and Google, YouTube. Their budget today is almost that big as the budget of the United States. So they are way more powerful than nation states, and they have the power to change the nation states' perception and reaction to their business goals. But there is still some important stuff we have forgotten, and this is public interest. Public interest is something very important. So we can still define it, we can follow it. And especially now in the COVID-19 crisis, everything seems to be clearer because the disinformation on social media are suddenly fast and deadly, and we can immediately see the consequences. So it's time to reconsider again. Are social media platforms or media? Is there any way how to create public social media, like we created public TV? Is there any way how to regulate commercial social media as we regulated commercial TV? How far can we go? There is a time to reconsider, and we definitely have to do this, because otherwise our civilization is going under. We have been attacked in the very core value of our civilization. This is our ability to recognize the truth. If we lose it, we die.
Thank you for that response, Alexandra. I'm going to go to a question from Ryan from our YouTube channel. And he asks, are measures to defend against and respond to information warfare most appropriate within the domain of information, or are there other domains of warfare appropriate for defense and response measures?
The problem of hybrid warfare and information warfare, that it's always a lot of layers together. It's never a single action, a single branch of actions. This is our great disadvantage, because let's speak about Russia, because Russia is not the only one phenomena on the disinformation field today, but they are still the best in town. Russia changed the paradigm of warfare by using its oligarchs as soldiers or officers of providing money and action to different parts of that battlefield. They can buy services of social media experts. They can buy hackers. They can buy active measures actors, people from former state security services who are right now as subcontractors available for different shadowy operations. They can buy anything you can imagine. So we have to find the way how our response, there's basically two ways how to defend ourselves. The one is the very central, very direct, and very unpopular, because we still hesitate to do this. It's to hit the octopus to its head, no matter how many tentacles it has. And the second, what we are trying right now and practicing right now, is to fight against these tentacles, all of them at once, which of course makes you very tired, because it occupies a lot of your capacity. And right now in the COVID-19 crisis, you need a lot of the necessary defense capacity at home, because the intel, army, and all these state services, their capacity is needed elsewhere. So it's complicated to react on this second way I've described, to react by fighting each tentacle at once. It's not easy. Yeah, so I think we have to gain more knowledge about the head of the octopus. General Nadav Zafrir, the head of the former Israeli Unit 8200, now a private subcontractor in some kind of cyber defense companies, said in one conference very interesting sentence: in order to mitigate the gap between offense and defense, you have to have an attacker's mind. So I think it's time to get the attacker's mind.
I think that's a really interesting point, to get inside their mind. Given the time it is now, I'll ask one last question. And this question is related to Canada specifically. So the question is there a significant difference in the content or tone of political communications in Canada compared to other countries you have worked in? I feel as though a lot of people see Canada kind of as an island of sorts, and that disinformation and propaganda doesn't influence us as much. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think there is a huge difference. You Canadians, you have a huge advantage. You do not see it anymore. In the top 10 charts of OECD education, you are still pointing the first 10 in the world among Singapore or Asian states. You have unbelievably high literacy as such. It means the ability to read the text, to understand the text. So you are a very educated nation, which is a huge resource of resilience generally. This is first. Second, when I see the quality of political discourse, it was first, when I came to Canada 2016, it was a real surprise to me that it's formally very unified, or there is a strength code of political communication and rules, which you stick with that rules. To me, it sounded, when I compare it to political discourse in former Eastern European countries or even in America, I see the broken taboos everywhere exploding, like politicians and their campaign masters are trying to get closer to the people, to be more understandable, to sound more rural. Not to get that high level of communication form. But here in Canada, it's still remarkable how high the level of the political communication is. And first, I think, oh gosh, this is a little bit old school, isn't it? But the more I see under the level of the modern information warfare, the more I'm convinced it's actually okay. It's right, stick with it. Because if you hold the high demand, if you hold the high approach of communication, if you never get down to that highly sensibilized atmosphere of hatred. If they are forbidden words, it's good. It's actually, the form helps you to protect the whole environment against the malevolent content. It's very good, and you should stay with that. That's actually respect.
Great. Well, I think we will cut it off there as far as our public questions are concerned. Martine, thanks so much for helping to moderate those. And Joseph, your discussion was outstanding. Alexandra, I was just hoping to ask you one more thing. And that's just a little bit of your response to see, to bring things back. We are at a moment when NATO is trying to fight disinformation by just restating the truth and by pointing out that disinformation is a huge problem. Is that enough from what you've seen? Do you think it's working? I'm just very curious as to what your response is to NATO's attempt to fight disinformation with truth.
I think basically it's okay. The method is fine. But the problem is, it worked 1981 when America finally realized that Russia is attacking them with disinformation, strong disinformation campaign stream like the Operation Infection and stuff. And they created a powerful team under President Reagan, where they tried to combat disinformation with exposing the resources, where the disinformation originate and what's the reality. The problem is we are now in completely different era and in different environment. First of all, there is no President Reagan anymore. They are just states highly in trouble because NATO countries are right now, there is a strong, successful attempt of bad actors to divide these nations and hold them divided. So given the fact that we have no Reagan anymore, and the coordination of exposing bad actors is way more difficult. And the second, what I said was, we are not in the time of local disinformation activities. We have internet and social media. And Churchill said once that the lie runs 6 times around the globe while the truth is still trying to get dressed. And this simple sentence in the era of internet and social media is 10 times more valid. The capacity of information channels is more important than the content. I'm really convinced this is the thing. And we are fighting. You can't defeat your enemy who is attacking you outside of your own scope and authorization. An army cannot defeat an enemy who is fighting with money, with buying TV channels, with buying subcontracting services on the cyber field, with sociologists, historians, people who deal with that narratives and create perfect strategies on the field of of the social sciences, with oligarchs who finance with their huge scope of financing of different operations. The army has to obey the leader, the political leadership. So it's completely asymmetric. And within the scope of the army and of the defense is to expose the truth and expose the bad actors a good way, because we still need the reference point where the truth is. We need to have some places of internet where we grab, where we go if unsure, but it's not enough. We need the majority. We need to be better in the capacity, in the volume of the communication capacity. I don't know how, but we need to achieve this, because otherwise, bad endings.
Yeah, and to see all that we have built start to be pushed aside would be an absolute tragedy, considering how much we have sacrificed to get where we are.
Yes.
So what a perfect way to end this discussion, Alexandra. The NATO Association is trying to do just this, to make sure that our narrative, which includes within it critique, but also understands just how much we have when we are united as opposed to divided. That is the whole concept of NATO, and I'm really so thrilled to come and dazzle us with all of your anecdotes. The way you bring everything together is just so enjoyable, and I know that I'm joined by both Joseph and Martine to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thanks to our audience as well. I hope you will join us for our future events and pay attention. Thanks so much.